What would you do if everyone in the room was laughing at you? What if in that single humiliating moment you had the power to silence them all? This is the story of one woman who did exactly that. And what happened next will leave you breathless. Picture this: a grand ballroom in Chicago. Crystal chandeliers, designer gowns. The city's wealthiest elite gathered for the charity event of the season. And in the center of it all, a homeless woman sits at a 9-foot Steinway grand piano. Her hands, weathered and trembling, hover over the keys. The room which moments ago was filled with cruel laughter and whispered insults has fallen completely silent. One note, that's all it took. One single note, and tears began streaming down the faces of people who just 30 minutes earlier wanted her thrown out into the street. But let me take you back to how this all began. Because the journey to that piano bench is a story of loss of dignity and of the most powerful performance you will ever hear about. 30 minutes earlier, the same ballroom, champagne flowing, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, 400 of Chicago's most prominent citizens writing checks, networking, celebrating their generosity. And then the double doors at the entrance opened, and she walked in. Dorothy Hayes, 58 years old. Her coat was 3 sizes too big, probably pulled from a donation bin. Her shoes were held together with duct tape. Her hair, once carefully styled for concert halls across America, now gray and matted. She moved slowly, carefully, as if every step required permission she didn't have. The whispers started immediately. "How did she get in here? Someone call security. This is ridiculous. Can you believe this?" Some people turned away uncomfortable. Others stared, their faces twisted with disgust or pity, or that particular kind of contempt that comes so easily to those who've never known hardship. But Dorothy kept walking, her eyes fixed on something across the room. The grand piano, its black lacquer surface gleaming under the chandeliers, its lid propped open, inviting, waiting. How did a homeless woman end up at Chicago's most exclusive charity gala? And what gave her the courage to walk toward that piano while 400 people watched, judged, and mocked? The answer to those questions is a story that will break your heart and then put it back together in a way you never expected. The Pinnacle Hotel Ballroom was the kind of place where a single flower arrangement cost more than most people's monthly rent. Tonight's charity gala Music for Tomorrow was raising money for youth arts programs across Chicago. The irony of that would become clear very soon. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago society. Corporate executives, real estate moguls, politicians, the kind of people whose names appeared on hospital wings and museum galleries. They stood in clusters glasses of Dom Perignon in hand, discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes in Aspen. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided through the crowd with trays of canapes. A live auction was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Everyone was having a wonderful time. And then Dorothy Hayes walked in. She had entered through the main doors, somehow bypassing the check-in table, where guests showed their $250 tickets. Maybe the volunteers assumed she was with catering. Maybe in the chaos of a large event she simply slipped through. It doesn't really matter how. What matters is that she was there, and she was moving with purpose. Margaret Brennan saw her first. Margaret, 63, wife of a pharmaceutical executive wearing a gown that cost more than some cars. She was mid-sentence telling her friend Patricia about her recent trip to Provence when she noticed Dorothy shuffling past. Her words died in her throat. She nudged Patricia. Patricia gasped softly. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "Is that a homeless person?" The whispers spread like ripples in water. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone's champagne glass paused halfway to their lips. The string quartet kept playing oblivious, but the energy in the room had shifted. Discomfort. Confusion. And for some anger. "This is outrageous," a man in a tailored tuxedo muttered to his companion. "We paid good money for this event. This is supposed to be a safe space." A safe space? From what? From reality. From people who don't fit into your carefully curated world. But he wasn't alone in his sentiment. Others were nodding. Some were already looking around for security. Dorothy felt their eyes. How could she not? She had once performed for audiences twice this size, audiences who looked at her with admiration and anticipation. Now these people looked at her like she was something to be removed, something unclean, something that didn't belong. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. But she kept walking. Because tonight wasn't about them. Tonight was about a promise, a memory, a daughter who loved to hear her mother play. The grand piano sat on a raised platform at the far end of the ballroom. It was meant to be played later in the evening by a hired pianist, some Berkeley graduate, who would provide background music during dinner. But right now it stood alone, magnificent. Calling to her, Dorothy reached the base of the platform. 3 steps led up to the piano. She placed her hand on the railing. The metal was cool under her palm. She could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her back. She could hear the whispers growing louder. What is she doing? Is she going to play? This is absurd. Someone needs to stop this. 2 security guards in dark suits were already moving through the crowd. They had been stationed near the entrance and had spotted Dorothy the moment the complaints started. They approached quickly, but not urgently. This was a classy event. No need to make a scene. They would escort her out quietly. But before they reached her, something unexpected happened. A woman's voice cut through the murmur. Wait. Everyone turned. The voice belonged to Catherine Reynolds. If you didn't know Chicago society, that name might mean nothing to you. But if you did, you knew that Catherine Reynolds was not someone you ignored. At 72, she was one of the city's most generous philanthropists. Her late husband had built a tech empire in the 90s. When he died, she inherited everything and proceeded to give most of it away. Her foundation funded dozens of arts programs, including this one. When Catherine Reynolds spoke at one of these events, people listened. She stood near the front, her silver hair immaculately styled, her blue eyes sharp with curiosity. She raised one hand, stopping the security guards in their tracks. "I want to see what happens," she said simply. The room erupted in hushed protests. "Catherine, surely you don't mean..." "This is highly inappropriate. We can't just let..." Catherine turned to face the crowd. Her expression was calm but firm. "This is a fundraiser for music education, for giving everyone access to the arts. And now, when someone actually wants to approach an instrument, we're going to have her removed. I'd like to see what she does. If anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to leave." No one moved. Whether they agreed with Catherine or not, no one was going to challenge her. Not publicly. Not here. The security guards stepped back, uncertain. The crowd settled into an uncomfortable silence. And Dorothy, who had frozen on the second step, her hand gripping the railing, slowly turned to look at Catherine. Their eyes met across the room. Catherine gave her a small nod. Permission. encouragement. Dorothy climbed the final step and walked to the piano. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Dorothy Hayes was before she became invisible, before the streets, before the loss, before everything fell apart. 20 years ago, Dorothy Hayes was someone. She grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where music poured out of every church, every storefront, every open window on summer evenings. Her grandmother had an old upright piano in the living room. It was out of tune and missing 3 keys, but to 5-year-old Dorothy it might as well have been magic. Her grandmother couldn't afford lessons, but she didn't need to pay anyone. Dorothy taught herself. She would sit at that piano for hours picking out melodies she'd heard on the radio, figuring out harmonies by ear, creating her own compositions, before she even knew that's what they were called. By the time she was 8, people would gather outside her grandmother's apartment just to listen through the open windows. A music teacher from her elementary school noticed her talent, Mrs. Patterson. She stayed after school with Dorothy 3 days a week, teaching her to read music, introducing her to composers she'd never heard of. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Debussy. Dorothy devoured it all. The piano wasn't just an instrument to her. It was a language, a way to say things she didn't have words for. When Dorothy was 14, Mrs. Patterson entered her into a city-wide competition. Young musicians from every corner of Chicago. Kids who'd had private lessons since they were 3. Kids with Steinways in their living rooms, and summer programs at prestigious conservatories. Dorothy showed up in a borrowed dress, her music in a folder held together with rubber bands. She won. Not second place. Not honorable mention. First place. The judges said they'd never heard anything like it. Technical perfection combined with raw emotional power. One judge said she didn't just play the piano, she spoke through it. That competition changed everything. Suddenly there were scholarships, opportunities, a full ride to the Chicago College of Performing Arts, then Juilliard for her master's degree. By the time Dorothy was 25, she was performing in concert halls. Real ones: Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, Symphony Hall in Boston. Critics called her transcendent, a once-in-a-generation talent, the future of American classical piano. She had an agent, a recording contract, a calendar booked 2 years in advance. She traveled the world: London, Paris, Tokyo, Vienna, standing ovations in every city. Encore after encore, flowers thrown onto the stage, her face on the covers of classical music magazines. And through it all, through the success and the acclaim and the whirlwind of it all, Dorothy stayed grounded. She remembered her grandmother's apartment, the out-of-tune upright, Mrs. Patterson staying late to teach her for free. She never forgot where she came from. At 31, she met James, a middle school music teacher. He'd come to one of her concerts in Chicago, bought the cheapest seat in the balcony. Afterward, through some combination of luck and determination, he managed to find his way backstage. He was nervous, stammering. He told her that her performance had moved him to tears, that he'd never heard anything so beautiful. They were married 8 months later. It should have been a fairy tale. The brilliant pianist and the humble music teacher who loved her. And for a while it was. They had a small apartment in Brooklyn, then later a house in New Jersey with a music room. Dorothy continued to perform. James taught middle schoolers to appreciate Mozart. They talked about starting a music school together one day, a place where kids like Dorothy had been could get the training they deserved. And then when Dorothy was 35, they had a daughter, Grace. Grace Hayes came into the world on a Tuesday morning in March, and from the moment Dorothy held her, nothing else mattered quite as much. The concerts were still important. The music was still her passion. But Grace was everything. Dorothy cut back on performing. She still played, but more selectively. She wanted to be home, to watch Grace grow, to teach her to play if she wanted to learn. James supported the decision completely. They had enough saved. They could make it work. Grace did want to learn. Of course she did. She had her mother's talent, her father's patience, and a joy in music that was uniquely her own. By the time Grace was 7, she could play Für Elise perfectly. By 10, she was tackling Chopin. Dorothy would sit beside her at the piano, guiding her hands, beaming with pride. "You're going to be even better than me," Dorothy would tell her. Impossible, Grace would laugh. But it was possible. It was probable. Grace had everything ahead of her. Talent, youth, opportunity. Her whole life stretched out like a beautiful composition waiting to be played. Until suddenly, it didn't. Grace was 16 when the headaches started. At first, they seemed normal. Teenage stuff. Too much screen time. Not enough sleep. Stress from school. Dorothy gave her Tylenol and told her to rest. The headaches continued. Then came the fatigue. Grace would come home from school and immediately go to bed. She'd sleep for hours. Dorothy worried, but tried not to panic. Maybe she was anemic. Maybe she needed vitamins. Then, one morning, Grace didn't wake up. She wasn't unconscious. She was just gone. Somewhere else. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. She didn't respond to her name. Dorothy called 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. James held Grace in his arms, whispering to her, begging her to come back. The ambulance arrived. The hospital. Tests. So many tests. MRI, CT scan, blood work, doctors with serious faces and clipboards. Dorothy and James sat in a waiting room with fluorescent lights and stale coffee, holding hands, not speaking, both of them praying to any god who would listen. Finally, a doctor came out. Young. Too young to be delivering this kind of news. He sat down across from them. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your daughter has acute lymphoblastic leukemia." 5 words. That's all it took to shatter everything. Leukemia. Cancer. Their 16-year-old daughter had cancer. The doctor kept talking. Treatment options. Chemotherapy. Clinical trials. Survival rates. Dorothy heard it all through a fog. Her brain couldn't process it. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was Grace. Grace who played Chopin. Grace who laughed at terrible jokes and loved strawberry ice cream and wanted to study music at Berkeley. This couldn't be happening to her. But it was happening. The next 2 years became a blur of hospital rooms and treatment schedules and desperate hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Grace fought. God, she fought so hard. Through the chemo that made her sick for days, through losing her hair, through the pain that no 16-year-old should ever have to endure. She fought with everything she had. Dorothy stopped performing. Completely. Canceled every concert. Broke her recording contract. She didn't care. Her daughter needed her. Nothing else mattered. James kept teaching for as long as he could, but eventually he had to quit too. Someone needed to be with Grace during the day while Dorothy was with her at night. They tag-teamed. They exhausted themselves. They poured everything they had into keeping their daughter alive. The medical bills piled up. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. There were experimental treatments, specialists, medications that cost more per dose than most people made in a month. Dorothy and James burned through their savings. Then they took out loans. Then they mortgaged the house. Then they maxed out credit cards. None of it mattered. They would have sold everything they owned, lived on the street themselves if it meant Grace would be okay. But Grace wasn't okay. She had good days. Days when she would sit up in her hospital bed and smile and talk about the future. Days when she would ask Dorothy to play something on the small keyboard they'd brought to the room. Dorothy would play, tears streaming down her face, trying to keep her voice steady as she sang along. Grace would close her eyes and listen, and for a few minutes they could pretend everything was normal. But the good days became fewer. The cancer was aggressive, resistant. Nothing was working. On a Thursday morning in November, 2 days after Thanksgiving, with snow falling softly outside the hospital window, Grace Hayes took her last breath. Dorothy was holding her hand. James was on her other side. They were singing to her, softly. A lullaby Dorothy used to sing when Grace was a baby. Grace was 18 years old. She never made it to Berkeley. Never gave her first real concert. Never got to experience all the things Dorothy had dreamed for her. And just like that, she was gone. In the days after Grace died, Dorothy didn't play piano. Not once. She couldn't. Every note would remind her of Grace's fingers on the keys. Every song would be something Grace had loved or learned or asked her to play. The funeral was small. Grace's school friends, a few relatives, the pastor from their church who barely knew them but said kind things anyway. James stood beside Dorothy, his face blank with shock. Neither of them cried during the service. They had no tears left. After the funeral, they went home to a house that was too quiet. Grace's room was exactly as she'd left it. Her books, her clothes, her keyboard against the wall. Dorothy stood in the doorway, unable to enter, unable to walk away. James broke first. 2 weeks after they buried their daughter, Dorothy found him in the garage. He had tied a rope to one of the ceiling beams. She got there in time. Barely. She cut him down, called 911, held him while he sobbed into her shoulder, and apologized over and over. "I can't do this," he kept saying. "I can't do this without her." "You have to," Dorothy whispered. "We have to." But the truth was, she didn't know if she could either. James was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. When he came home, he was on medication, antidepressants, anti-anxiety pills. They helped, but they also made him distant, numb. He moved through the house like a ghost, and Dorothy was too exhausted to pull him back. And through it all, the bills kept coming. The hospital, the funeral home, the credit card companies, the mortgage company. Dorothy hadn't worked in 2 years. James wasn't working. They had nothing coming in and everything going out. Dorothy tried to get bookings again. She called her agent. She reached out to venues. But 2 years is a lifetime in classical music. People had forgotten about her, moved on. There were younger pianists now, fresher faces. She got rejection after rejection. "We've gone in a different direction. The market has changed. Perhaps in the future." 6 months after Grace died, the bank foreclosed on their house. Dorothy and James packed what they could carry and moved into a tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood. It was all they could afford. The piano had to stay behind. They couldn't take it. There was no room. Dorothy watched the movers carry it out to a truck, taking it to storage that they could never afford to pay for, and something inside her broke all over again. The apartment had thin walls and cockroaches and a radiator that barely worked. James deteriorated further. He stopped taking his medication. Said it made him feel worse. He stopped eating. stopped showering. Dorothy tried to help him, but she was drowning too. 9 months after Grace died, Dorothy came home from a job interview. She didn't get to find James unconscious on the bathroom floor. Empty pill bottles scattered around him. She called 911 again, but this time she was too late. The paramedics tried. They worked on him for 20 minutes. But James Hayes was gone. Dorothy buried her husband in a plot next to their daughter. She stood alone at the graveside. No service this time. No pastor. Just her and the rain and 2 headstones that represented everything she'd ever loved. After that, the apartment was impossible. Every surface reminded her of James. Every silence screamed with his absence. She stopped paying rent. She stopped caring. One day, the landlord changed the locks. Dorothy came home to find her belongings in garbage bags on the curb. She picked up what she could carry and walked away. She was 57 years old. She had no family, no friends left. Everyone had fallen away during the years of Grace's illness and after. People don't know what to say to someone who's lost a child. They get uncomfortable. They disappear. Dorothy Hayes, who had once played for kings and presidents, who had been called a genius, who had graced the stages of the world's greatest concert halls, became homeless. She found a shelter on the south side, got a bed when one was available, stood in line for meals, tried to be invisible. She stopped thinking about the future because there wasn't one. She existed. Day by day, hour by hour, waiting for nothing in particular. But tonight was different. Tonight was November 28th, Grace's birthday. She would have been 25 today. Dorothy had woken up in the shelter with that knowledge sitting on her chest like a stone. 25. Grace should have been 25. She should have graduated from Berkeley, should be performing somewhere, should be falling in love and living her life and being everything she was meant to be. Dorothy couldn't stay in the shelter. She walked. She walked for hours through Chicago's streets as the sun set and the temperature dropped. She wasn't going anywhere in particular. She just couldn't be still. And then she heard it. Music. She was walking past the Pinnacle Hotel. Through the doors, through the walls, she could hear a string quartet playing. Mozart, one of Grace's favorites. Dorothy stopped. She stood on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cold air, and listened. Grace had loved that piece, had asked Dorothy to play it for her in the hospital. Dorothy had played it at Grace's memorial service, or at least she'd tried. She'd broken down halfway through, and James had to help her from the piano. Standing outside the hotel, listening to that music, Dorothy felt something she hadn't felt in the 6 months since James died. She felt something other than emptiness. She walked to the hotel entrance. A doorman in a burgundy uniform stood by the glass doors. He saw her coming, and his expression shifted. He moved to block the entrance. "Ma'am, this is a private event. I just want to hear the music," Dorothy said. Her voice was hoarse. She barely used it anymore. "I'm sorry, you can't come in." But behind the doorman, someone opened the door to leave. A blast of warmth and light and music poured out, and in that moment something in Dorothy's chest shifted. Grace's birthday. Grace's favorite music. Grace, who had loved to hear her mother play. Dorothy moved before she could think about it. She slipped past the doorman through the open door into the hotel. "Hey," the doorman called after her, but Dorothy was already moving down the corridor, following the music pulled toward it like gravity. She reached the ballroom. The double doors were open. Inside, hundreds of people in evening wear. Champagne, chandeliers, and in the far corner a string quartet. and beyond them on a raised platform, a grand piano. Dorothy stopped breathing. She hadn't touched a piano in 6 years, hadn't played a single note since the day Grace asked her to play Chopin in the hospital room. That was the last time, the last song, the last note. But tonight was Grace's birthday, and Grace would want her to play. Dorothy stepped into the ballroom, and 400 people turned to stare. The whispers hit Dorothy like a physical wave. She felt them more than heard them. Judgment, disgust, confusion. She kept her eyes down and walked forward. One step, another. The piano was so far away, but then from somewhere in the crowd, a voice. Oh my God. A woman pushed through the clusters of guests. She was in her 60s, elegant, in a navy gown, her gray hair perfectly styled. She moved quickly, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Dorothy. Dorothy looked up. The woman's face was familiar, but Dorothy couldn't place it. Too many years. Too much loss. Her memory was full of holes. Dorothy Hayes, the woman said again, louder now. She was close enough to touch. Is that really you? Other people were listening now, turning. The name seemed to trigger something. Hayes. Dorothy Hayes. Some of them knew that name. Some of them remembered. The woman reached out and gently took Dorothy's arm. It's me, Catherine Reynolds, though it was Catherine Bradford when we met. Do you remember the Young Musicians competition? 20 years ago, I was one of the judges. And suddenly, Dorothy did remember. Catherine Bradford. She had been on the panel for dozens of competitions. She had written recommendation letters for Dorothy's scholarship applications. She had hugged Dorothy after she won the Avery Fisher Prize. Catherine Dorothy whispered. My God, Dorothy, what happened to you? Catherine's eyes were filling with tears. We heard you'd stopped performing, that you'd had some family troubles, but no one knew. Family troubles. What a gentle way to describe the complete destruction of everything you've ever loved, my daughter Dorothy said. The words came out cracked. She died. My husband. Both gone. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Dorothy, oh no. People were crowding closer now. They had heard the name, Dorothy Hayes. Some of them pulled out their phones, typing quickly. Google search results loaded. Images of a younger Dorothy in an evening gown standing on stage. Headlines. Rising star of classical piano. Dorothy Hayes captivates Carnegie Hall. The pianist everyone's talking about. That's her, someone said. That's actually her. What's she doing here? Why does she look like that? The questions swirled. Dorothy felt dizzy. This was a mistake. She shouldn't have come in. She should leave. But Catherine was still holding her arm gently but firmly, as if she knew Dorothy might bolt. Why are you here tonight? Catherine asked softly. The music, Dorothy said. I heard it from outside. It's my daughter's birthday. Was. Would have been. She couldn't get the tenses right. She loved that Mozart piece. Catherine's expression softened even further. She glanced toward the piano, then back at Dorothy. Did you come to play? The question hung in the air. Around them, the crowd had fallen silent. Everyone was listening, waiting. Had she come to play, Dorothy didn't know. She just knew she needed to be near a piano today, needed to be close to music on Grace's birthday. But play. Actually sit down and put her fingers on the keys and make sound. She hadn't played in 6 years. Her hands shook constantly now from malnutrition and stress. Her mind was foggy. She probably couldn't remember even simple pieces. And these people, these wealthy donors in their expensive clothes, they would judge every note. They already thought she was pathetic. Playing would only confirm it. But then she thought of Grace in the hospital bed, her bald head on the pillow, smiling weakly as she said, "Play something for me, Mom. Please." And Dorothy had played, even though her fingers stumbled, even though she cried through the whole thing. She had played because Grace asked her to. "Yes," Dorothy said. "I came to play." A ripple went through the crowd. Some people looked skeptical, others curious. A few were outright hostile. One man in a tuxedo laughed. "This should be interesting," he said to his companion. "This ought to be a train wreck." But Catherine ignored him. She kept her eyes on Dorothy. "Then you should play," she said. "You absolutely should play." She turned to face the crowd, still holding Dorothy's arm. Some of you may remember Dorothy Hayes. 20 years ago, she was one of the most gifted pianists in the country. She performed in the world's greatest concert halls. She was extraordinary. And tonight, on her daughter's birthday, she's going to play for us. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people nodded, willing to give her a chance. Others looked uncomfortable. The man who had predicted a train wreck rolled his eyes, but no one left. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Catherine guided Dorothy toward the platform. The string quartet had stopped playing. They watched instruments lowered as Dorothy climbed the 3 steps. As she approached the piano, it was a Steinway Model D, 9 feet of perfection, black lacquer gleaming. The bench was positioned exactly right. The lid was open, the strings exposed, waiting. Dorothy stood beside it, one hand resting on the smooth wood. She felt 400 pairs of eyes on her, felt their doubt, their pity, their curiosity. Could she do this? Could she actually sit down and play after 6 years of silence, after everything she'd lost, after she'd become this broken, empty version of herself? She thought of Grace. Always Grace. Grace at 5, banging on the out-of-tune upright. Grace at 10, concentrating hard on a difficult passage. Grace at 16, in a hospital bed, asking for music. Dorothy sat down on the bench. The bench was familiar. Piano benches were all basically the same. The right height, the right distance from the keys. Dorothy's body remembered this position even if her mind was full of static and fear. She placed her hands in her lap. They were shaking badly, worse than usual. She looked down at them. These hands that had once moved across keys with the speed and precision of a hummingbird's wings. These hands that critics had called miraculous and poetry in motion. Now they were thin, bony, the skin dry and cracked, the nails broken. Could these hands still play? The ballroom was completely silent. 400 people holding their collective breath, waiting. The waiters had stopped moving. The bartender had paused mid-pour. Even the chandeliers seemed to hang more still than before. Dorothy looked at the keys. 88 of them. Black and white, ivory and ebony. She knew everyone. Had spent 30,000 hours of her life touching them, coaxing sound from them, making them sing. But it had been so long. 6 years since she'd played. 6 years of loss and grief and survival. 6 years of forgetting who she used to be. The Dorothy who played piano was dead. She died in a hospital room with her daughter. She was buried next to her husband. This Dorothy, this hollow shell, couldn't possibly make music. But she had to try. For Grace. Dorothy lifted her hands. Slowly. They hovered over the keys, trembling. She could hear someone in the crowd whisper, "Is she even going to do it?" Another person snickered. She closed her eyes. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw Grace. Not Grace in the hospital bed. Not sick Grace. Not dying Grace. Grace at 12, sitting beside her at their home piano, learning Für Elise. Grace laughing when she hit a wrong note. Grace concentrating, her tongue poking out slightly between her lips the way she always did when she was focused. "You can do it, Mom," Grace's voice whispered in her memory. "Just play." Dorothy opened her eyes. She lowered her hands to the keys. The first touch was electric. The moment Dorothy's fingers made contact with the keys, something jolted through her entire body. Muscle memory. Cellular recognition. These keys, this instrument, this was home. But she didn't press down yet. She just held her fingers there, resting on middle C and the notes around it, feeling the slight coolness of the ivory, feeling the decades of her life compressed into this single point of connection. In the crowd, someone coughed. Uncomfortable. Awkward. How long was she going to just sit there? But Dorothy was somewhere else. She was remembering the first time she played a Steinway. She was 15. A competition in Milwaukee. She'd only ever played on cheap uprights and the battered piano at her school. When she sat down at that Steinway, when she played that first note, it was like discovering color after living in black and white. The memory steadied her. She took a breath, and she pressed down. One note. A single middle C. Clear and pure and perfect. The sound resonated through the ballroom, through the air, through the sudden absolute silence. And then she released it. Let it fade. Someone in the crowd started to speak, but their companion shushed them. Everyone was watching Dorothy's face. Her eyes were closed again. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She pressed another note. F, then A, then C again, an octave higher. Individual notes. Slow, separate. Like she was greeting old friends. Testing. Remembering. Her right hand moved. Played a simple scale. C major. Up and down. Something a child would play in their first lesson. But her fingers remembered. Despite the shaking. Despite 6 years of silence. They remembered where to go. Her left hand joined. Simple chords, C, F, G, the building blocks of music, the foundation of everything. In the crowd, Margaret Brennan leaned toward her friend, Patricia. "Is this it?" she whispered. "Is she just going to play scales?" But then Dorothy's hands shifted, both of them. They found a melody, simple at first, a children's song that Grace had loved, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But Dorothy played it differently. Slower, with small embellishments, jazz chords. She played it like a lullaby, like a memory. Her hands were still shaking. She fumbled a note, had to stop and restart. But she kept going. The melody continued. And slowly, gradually, the shaking began to subside. The muscle memory was taking over. Her fingers knew what to do, even if her conscious mind didn't trust them. She finished Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and let the last note ring out. There was a smattering of polite applause. Confused, uncertain. That was nice, but Dorothy opened her eyes. She looked at the keys, and she made a decision. If this was the last time she would ever play piano, if this was her goodbye to music and to Grace and to everything she used to be, then she was going to play what mattered. She was going to play the piece that Grace had asked for in the hospital. The one Dorothy had started but couldn't finish. The one that had broken her heart. Chopin. Nocturne in E-flat, Major Opus 9, number 2. She positioned her hands, and she began. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne are delicate, fragile, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Dorothy's right hand played the melody, each note carefully placed, while her left hand provided the gentle, rolling accompaniment. At first, her playing was hesitant, careful. She was feeling her way through measure by measure, making sure her fingers remembered the patterns. There were small mistakes. A note held too long. A chord slightly out of sync. But she pushed through. In the ballroom, the energy shifted. People stopped whispering, stopped fidgeting. They began to actually listen, because something was happening. With each passing phrase, Dorothy's playing grew stronger, more confident. The hesitation faded. Her fingers, which had felt so foreign and clumsy moments ago, were remembering their purpose. This was what they were made for. This was what they had spent 30,000 hours learning to do. The Nocturne's melody is one of the most beautiful in all of piano literature. Romantic, tender, heartbreaking in its simplicity. And as Dorothy played, as her fingers moved with increasing fluidity across the keys, she began to pour something into it. Something beyond technique, beyond notes on a page. She poured in Grace. Grace learning this piece when she was 14. Grace playing it for her father on their anniversary. Grace humming it in the hospital when she was too weak to get out of bed. Dorothy's eyes closed again. She didn't need to see the keys anymore. Her hands knew where to go. And now finally, after 6 years of silence, after 6 years of being too broken to make music, she was playing, really playing. The melody soared. Dorothy's right hand danced across the high notes while her left hand provided the foundation. The rhythm swayed. Chopin's nocturnes are meant to sound like night music, like dreams, like whispered secrets in the dark. And that's exactly what Dorothy gave them. In the crowd, people began to react. Not with polite applause or awkward coughs, with genuine attention. Heads tilted, listening, eyes closed in concentration. This wasn't what they expected. This was actually good. Catherine Reynolds stood near the front, tears already streaming down her face. She remembered Dorothy at 25. Brilliant, unstoppable, on the verge of becoming one of the greats. And here she was again, still brilliant, maybe even more so because of everything she'd survived. The piece built. Chopin wrote in dynamic swells, moments where the music grows louder and more passionate before retreating again into delicate whispers. Dorothy navigated these shifts perfectly. When the music called for power, she gave it. When it demanded tenderness, she delivered. But more than that, she was interpreting. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. Her story. Grace's story. A story about love and loss, and the unbearable weight of continuing when everything you love is gone. Margaret Brennan, who had been one of the first to whisper complaints when Dorothy entered, found herself unable to look away. She gripped Patricia's hand without realizing it. "My God," she whispered. "Listen to her." The man in the tuxedo who had predicted a train wreck stood frozen, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. His companion had tears on her cheeks. Around the ballroom, phones that had been raised to record the spectacle slowly lowered. This wasn't something to watch through a screen. This demanded full presence. Dorothy reached the middle section of the Nocturne. Here, Chopin introduces a slightly different melody, still beautiful, but tinged with melancholy. A question asked without answer. Dorothy's interpretation was devastating. Each note felt like a goodbye, each phrase like a memory slipping away. Her hands no longer shook. They moved with purpose, with certainty. The years fell away. She wasn't a homeless woman at a charity gala. She was Dorothy Hayes, concert pianist, artist, mother. The music swelled again, louder, fuller, both hands working in perfect synchronization. The melody climbed higher, more urgent, more desperate. And then at the peak, a sudden softness, a retreat, the storm passing, the night quiet again. Dorothy played through it all with her eyes closed, her face wet with tears she didn't notice. She was somewhere else. She was in Grace's hospital room. She was at the funeral. She was in the empty apartment. She was at James's grave. She was every moment of the last 6 years compressed into this one performance. And the music held it all. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, as the melody prepared to return one final time, Dorothy's playing took on an almost supernatural quality. It wasn't just technically perfect, it transcended technique. It was pure emotion translated into sound. In the ballroom, no one moved. No one breathed. The waiters stood still, trays balanced. The bartender had abandoned his station. The string quartet members stood with their instruments hanging loose, listening with the intensity of fellow artists recognizing genius. And Dorothy played on. The final return of the nocturne's main melody is where everything comes together. All the themes, all the emotions, everything Chopin intended, and everything Dorothy brought to it. Her hands moved across the keys with a fluidity that seemed impossible moments ago. But this wasn't about her hands anymore. This was about something deeper, something that lived in the space between the notes, in the silence between phrases, in the breath between heartbeats. Dorothy's interpretation of the final section wasn't just beautiful, it was transcendent. She played the melody with a tenderness that made it feel like a lullaby, like she was singing grace to sleep one last time. The right-hand melody floated above the left-hand accompaniment like a voice calling from far away. Soft, but clear. Distant, but present. And then, in a moment that no one who was there would ever forget, Dorothy added something extra. A slight variation in the final phrase. Not improvisation exactly, more like personalization. She bent a note, held another longer than written, added the smallest ornament that Chopin himself might have approved of. It was the difference between performing music and living it. The sound filled the ballroom. It seemed impossible that one person and one instrument could create this much emotion, this much presence. But there it was, undeniable, overwhelming. In the audience, Catherine Reynolds wasn't the only one crying anymore. Dozens of people had tears streaming down their faces. Hardened businessmen who prided themselves on emotional control. Society women who lived by rules of decorum and propriety. Young professionals who came tonight for networking and ended up witnessing something they'd never forget. One woman near the back, a corporate lawyer named Jennifer Chen, would later tell friends that listening to Dorothy play that night changed her life. She quit her job the following month and went back to school to study music therapy. I realized I'd spent 20 years caring about the wrong things, she said. Dorothy Hayes reminded me what actually matters. But in the moment, Jennifer just stood and wept. A man named Robert Walsh, who had whispered to his wife earlier that this was ridiculous, that someone should remove this woman now, stood with his hand over his mouth, trying to contain his emotions. His wife Sarah held his other hand, squeezing it hard, her own face wet with tears. "I don't understand," Robert whispered. "Why is this affecting me so much?" Sarah shook her head. She couldn't explain it either, but they both felt it. Everyone did. Dorothy wasn't just playing Chopin. She was playing humanity. She was playing loss and love and survival and grief and hope and despair and everything in between. The technical brilliance was undeniable. Her fingers moved with the speed and precision of a professional musician at the height of their powers. The trills were crisp. The scales were even. The chords were perfectly voiced. Critics at Carnegie Hall had praised these same qualities 20 years ago. But the technical brilliance wasn't what made people cry. It was the soul in it, the raw, unfiltered emotion. Dorothy had nothing left to lose, nothing to prove, nothing to hide behind. She played with the kind of honesty that only comes from complete devastation. She had been broken down to nothing, and what remained was pure truth. Every note said, "I loved, I lost, I survived, I'm still here." The melody climbed higher, the dynamics swelled. Dorothy's whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly, leaning into the fortissimo passages, pulling back in the quiet moments. She and the piano had become one entity, inseparable. Someone near the middle of the room, a man who had checked his watch 5 minutes ago out of boredom, now found himself transfixed. He had attended hundreds of concerts, opera, symphony, chamber music. He considered himself a connoisseur, but he had never experienced anything like this. This wasn't a performance. This was a revelation. The nocturne built toward its climax. Not a loud climax. Chopin didn't write that way, but an emotional climax. The melody reached its highest point, suspended there for one crystalline moment, and then began its descent. Coming back down, settling, resolving. Dorothy played through it with tears streaming steadily down her face. She didn't wipe them away, didn't acknowledge them. She just played. Her hands, those weathered, broken hands, created sounds of such beauty that it seemed to hurt. Beautiful things often do. In the hospital, on Grace's last day, Dorothy had tried to play this nocturne. She had gotten halfway through before her hands stopped working, before her grief physically prevented her from continuing. She had collapsed onto the keyboard, sobbing while James held her, and Grace whispered, "It's okay, Mom. It's okay." But it wasn't okay then. Maybe it still wasn't okay now. But at least now Dorothy could play through to the end. At least now she could finish what she started. For Grace. For James. For herself. The music began to quiet. Softer. More delicate. The final phrases of the nocturne are like a whisper, like the last words before sleep. Dorothy played them with infinite tenderness, each note given its full value, each silence honored. And then there was only one chord left, the final E-flat major chord, resolution, peace, home. Dorothy's hands came down on the keys one last time. The chord rang out clear and full and perfect. And then slowly, it began to fade. Dorothy held her hands on the keys, sustaining the chord, with the pedal letting it resonate through the ballroom, through the air, through 400 stunned people. The sound decayed, grew softer, more distant, like something precious slipping away, like Grace's last breath, like James's hand going limp in hers, like everything she'd ever loved becoming memory. Finally, when the sound had faded to almost nothing, Dorothy released the pedal. The last vibration died. Silence fell. Complete and absolute silence. 10 seconds of silence. In a room holding 400 people, not a single sound. No one moved. No one coughed. No one shifted weight. 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Dorothy sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had done it. She had played through to the end. She had given Grace the gift of completion. The nocturne that she couldn't finish in the hospital, she had finished now. 6 years late. But she had done it. And now she felt empty, hollow. She had poured everything into those keys, every ounce of grief, every drop of love, every fragment of her shattered heart. And now there was nothing left. The silence continued. 5 more seconds, 15 total. Dorothy began to feel the weight of it. They hated it. They thought it was terrible. She had embarrassed herself and Catherine and everyone who had given her this chance. She should leave. She should stand up and walk out before they start laughing. She began to lift her hands from the keys. And then from somewhere in the middle of the room, a single sound. A sob. A woman crying. Not polite tears. Not a delicate dab at the corner of the eyes. Actual crying. Audible. Unrestrained. Dorothy looked up. The woman was in her 40s, wearing an emerald green gown. Her makeup was ruined. Her face was red. She had both hands over her mouth, trying to contain her sobs, but failing. Her husband or date stood beside her, one arm around her shoulders, his own face streaked with tears. And then someone else. A man near the front. He removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief he pulled from his tuxedo pocket. His hand shook. Then another person. And another. Like dominoes falling. Like a wave spreading outward from a stone thrown into still water. Crying. All over the ballroom. People who came here tonight to drink champagne and congratulate themselves on their generosity. People who had looked at Dorothy with disgust and contempt just 30 minutes ago, now weeping openly. Margaret Brennan's carefully applied mascara ran down her cheeks in black rivulets. She didn't care. She couldn't stop crying. Patricia beside her was the same. They held each other's hands and cried like they hadn't cried in years. Maybe ever. The man in the tuxedo who had predicted a train wreck stood with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. His companion had collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, making sounds that might have been sobs, or might have been something deeper. Grief long suppressed. Pain finally acknowledged. Catherine Reynolds stood near the front, tears flowing freely, a smile on her face despite the crying. She knew what she was witnessing. She had been in the music world for 50 years. She had heard the greatest pianists of multiple generations. And she knew that what Dorothy just did was more than a performance. It was a gift, a sharing of pure human experience. Robert Walsh, the man who had complained earlier, now had his arm around his wife Sarah, both of them crying. Sarah turned her face into his chest and whispered, "I'm so sorry." "For what?" he asked, his voice cracked. "For everything we take for granted. For everything we have that others have lost." He nodded, understanding. They were both thinking of their own children at home. Safe. Healthy. How easily things could be different. The crying wasn't universal. Some people weren't crying, but they were all affected. Every single person in that room had been moved, transformed, changed by what they'd just heard. A young waiter, probably 20 years old, stood against the wall with tears streaming down his face. He'd been working events like this for 2 years, had seen famous speakers, celebrity performers, politicians, but he'd never seen anything like this. He'd never felt anything like this. An older gentleman near the back, a judge who prided himself on his logical mind and his emotional control, stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched, fighting desperately not to cry. He lost the fight. Tears leaked from his eyes despite his best efforts. He didn't understand why this was affecting him so deeply. He didn't know Dorothy Hayes, didn't know her daughter, didn't know her story until whispers about it had spread through the crowd during the performance. But he felt it. The loss, the love, the impossible weight of continuing after everything falls apart. His wife had died 3 years ago. Cancer. He'd been fine, practical, stoic. He'd organized the funeral, settled the estate, moved on. That's what you do. You move on. But listening to Dorothy play, something in him broke, or maybe broke open. He realized he hadn't grieved, hadn't let himself feel it, and now suddenly he felt everything. He sobbed into his hands while strangers around him cried for their own reasons, their own losses, their own regrets. Music does this sometimes. The right piece played the right way at the right moment can crack open the armor we all wear, can make us feel things we've been avoiding, can remind us that we're all carrying weight we pretend isn't there. Dorothy had played that kind of music. The crying continued. People embraced who didn't know each other. Strangers comforting strangers, united in unexpected grief and recognition and humanity. And Dorothy sat at the piano, watching this confused and overwhelmed. She didn't understand why they were crying. She played for grace. She played for herself. She played because she needed to. But somehow it had become about all of them, too. The silence was broken now. The crying filled the space, but no one had applauded yet. No one had moved toward her. They were all still processing, still feeling, still overwhelmed. Dorothy slowly stood from the piano bench. Her legs were unsteady. She gripped the edge of the piano for support. She felt dizzy, exhausted, empty, but also somehow full, like she'd given away everything and received something back. What she didn't know, but something. She took a step away from the piano, and then someone started clapping. The first person to applaud was a young woman in her 20s. She was crying so hard she could barely see, but she clapped. Started clapping and couldn't stop. The sound cut through the crying like a bell. And then someone else joined. An older man. Then another person. Then 5 people. Then 20. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding. But not polite charity gala applause. Not the kind of clapping you do because it's expected. This was different. This was urgent, desperate, like they needed to express something, and this was the only way. The applause grew louder. People began to stand. One by one at first, then in groups, then all at once. 400 people rising to their feet, standing ovation. But it still wasn't enough. The clapping grew more intense, hands stinging, palms red, but they couldn't stop. Dorothy stood beside the piano, stunned. She looked out at the crowd, at all these people standing for her, applauding for her, crying for her, and she couldn't process it. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was homeless. She was nobody. She was just a broken woman who played piano on her daughter's birthday. But they saw something else. They saw what Catherine Reynolds had seen. They saw who Dorothy Hayes truly was, who she had always been beneath the loss and the tragedy and the circumstances that put her on the streets. They saw the artist, the genius, the survivor. The applause continued. 30 seconds. A minute. People were shouting now. Brava, incredible. Thank you, thank you. They were thanking her. Dorothy felt her knees weaken. She reached for the piano again, steadying herself. This was too much. Too overwhelming. Catherine Reynolds moved first. She walked through the crowd, climbed the platform steps, and approached Dorothy. She wrapped her arms around her, pulling her close. Dorothy stood rigid for a moment, unused to touch, unused to kindness. But then she collapsed into the embrace and sobbed into Catherine's shoulder. "You beautiful, extraordinary woman," Catherine whispered. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Dorothy couldn't answer, couldn't speak, could only cry. Other people began moving forward. A line formed. People wanted to approach Dorothy, to thank her, to touch her hand, to tell her what her playing had meant to them. The first was a middle-aged woman named Linda. She climbed the platform, tears still fresh on her face, and took Dorothy's hand. "My son," Linda said, her voice breaking. "My son died 2 years ago. Overdose. I haven't been able to listen to music since then. It hurt too much. But what you just played? Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that beauty still exists, that it's okay to feel. Thank you." She squeezed Dorothy's hand and moved away, making room for the next person. A man in his 60s. "I lost my wife last year. I didn't cry at her funeral. I thought I had to be strong. But listening to you play, I finally could. Thank you." Another woman. "My daughter is sick. I've been so angry, so lost. Your music reminded me to focus on the love, not the anger. Thank you." Person after person, each with their own story, their own loss, their own pain that Dorothy's playing had somehow touched. The line continued. Robert Walsh and his wife Sarah waited their turn. When they reached Dorothy, Robert said, "I'm sorry for thinking you didn't belong here, for wanting you removed. You belong here more than any of us." Sarah nodded. "You taught us something tonight, something we desperately needed to learn." Even the man in the tuxedo who had laughed earlier approached. He couldn't meet Dorothy's eyes. "I'm ashamed," he said simply. "I judged you. I was wrong. Please forgive me." Dorothy nodded. She forgave him. She forgave all of them, because she understood. People judge what they don't understand. People fear what reminds them of their own vulnerability. She had learned that lesson on the streets. The gala's organizer, a woman named Patricia Morrison, pushed through the crowd. She was crying too, but she was also smiling. She took both of Dorothy's hands in hers. "Dorothy Hayes," she said. "This gala is meant to raise money for music education programs for underprivileged youth. You've just shown everyone exactly why that matters, why music matters, how it can heal and transform and connect us. I want to offer you a position. Teaching piano to kids who can't afford lessons, kids who might be the next you. Will you consider it?" Dorothy stared at her. A teaching position. A job. Purpose. I don't have anywhere to live," she said. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "We'll handle that," Patricia said. "We'll find you housing, get you what you need." Please, say yes." Dorothy looked around the room. At all these faces, some familiar from her past life, most strangers, all of them looking at her with respect, with admiration, with recognition. 6 months ago, James died, and Dorothy thought her life was over, thought she had nothing left to give, nothing left to live for. But maybe she was wrong. Maybe there was still purpose, still meaning, still a reason to get up each day. She thought of Grace. Grace who loved music, who wanted to teach someday, who believed that everyone should have access to beauty. "Yes," Dorothy whispered. "I'll do it. For Grace." Patricia hugged her. Others crowded close. Someone was already on their phone arranging temporary housing. Someone else was writing a check to cover expenses. The fundraiser had been meant to raise $50,000. By the end of the night, they would raise over $300,000, all because of Dorothy. But Dorothy was barely aware of any of it. She was exhausted, emotionally wrung out. She needed to sit down, to process, to understand what had just happened. Catherine guided her to a chair off to the side, brought her water, sat beside her while the crowd continued to celebrate and cry and embrace each other. The gala had transformed into something else, something none of them expected, something they would talk about for years. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked softly. Dorothy took a sip of water. Her hands still shook, but differently now. Not from malnutrition or fear, from adrenaline, from emotion, from being alive in a way she hadn't felt in 6 years. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm confused. I played for Grace. I didn't mean to change 400 people's lives," Catherine finished. "To remind us all what actually matters, to show us the power of art and humanity and resilience." Dorothy shook her head. "I just played piano." "No," Catherine said firmly. "You did so much more than that. You bore witness to your own pain and somehow made it sacred. You transformed tragedy into beauty. You proved that a person's worth has nothing to do with their circumstances and everything to do with who they are. You are Dorothy Hayes, concert pianist, artist, teacher, survivor. You always were. The streets didn't take that from you. The loss didn't take that from you. Nothing can take that from you." Dorothy closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks again. But these tears felt different. Not just grief, something else too, something that might eventually become healing. "Grace would be proud," she whispered. Yes, Catherine agreed. She would be. They sat together in silence, watching the crowd slowly begin to settle. The formal program of the gala had been completely abandoned. No one cared. This was better than any program. This was real. Eventually, people began to leave. But they left changed. They left quieter, more thoughtful. They left with Dorothy's music still resonating in their minds and hearts. And Dorothy sat in a chair beside a piano she had played for the first time in 6 years, exhausted and overwhelmed and broken and whole all at once. It was Grace's birthday. Grace would have been 25. And Dorothy had given her the only gift she could. Music, love, memory, and the promise to keep going, to keep living, to honor her by continuing to create beauty in a world that had taken so much. The night wasn't over. There were still people who wanted to talk to Dorothy, arrangements to be made, plans to be discussed. But for now, in this moment, Dorothy just breathed, in and out, present, alive. She had played piano, and somehow the world had shifted. The ballroom slowly emptied. Guests departed in small groups, many of them still wiping tears, all of them talking in hushed, reverent tones about what they'd just witnessed. Some exchanged contact information with strangers they'd cried beside, forming connections born of shared emotional experience. Others walked out in thoughtful silence, processing privately. Dorothy remained seated beside the piano, Catherine still at her side. Patricia Morrison returned with a tablet and several other organizers. They had been working frantically for the past 30 minutes. Patricia said, sitting down across from her, "We've arranged a few things. I hope you'll accept our help," she explained quickly. One of the gala's board members owned apartment buildings across Chicago. He was offering Dorothy a one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, rent-free for the first year. Another donor had already transferred money to cover furnishing it. A third was arranging for clothing toiletries, everything Dorothy would need. "The teaching position is real," Patricia continued. "Our program works with 10 schools across the South and West sides. You'd teach piano to kids who want to learn but can't afford lessons. The salary isn't huge, but it's steady. Health insurance included. You could start as soon as you're ready." Dorothy listened, struggling to comprehend. 12 hours ago, she woke up in a shelter. She'd spent Grace's birthday walking the cold streets, believing she had nothing. And now strangers were offering her an apartment, a job, a future. Why, she asked. Her voice was barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Patricia smiled through fresh tears. "Because you reminded us why we do this work in the first place. Because you showed us that circumstances don't define worth. Because you need help, and we can give it. And honestly, because we want you to keep making music. The world needs what you have to offer." Catherine squeezed Dorothy's hand. "Let them help you, please." Dorothy thought about refusing. Pride, even after everything whispered that she shouldn't accept charity. But then she thought about Grace. If Grace were here, what would she say? She'd say, "Take the help." Say yes. Say thank you. Rebuild. Live. "Okay," Dorothy whispered. "Thank you, thank you." Patricia beamed. "We'll get you settled in the apartment tomorrow. Tonight we've booked you a room at the Pinnacle. Upstairs. You can rest. Sleep in a real bed. Shower. Order room service if you want. Catherine will take you up." Dorothy nodded numbly. Room service. The concept was foreign. She'd been eating from shelters and soup kitchens for 6 months. As Catherine helped Dorothy stand, preparing to guide her to the elevators, a final group approached. The string quartet members who had performed earlier. The cellist, a woman named Yuki in her 30s, spoke for the group in, "Hayes, we just wanted to say it was an honor to be in the room tonight. What you did was, we don't have words. We're musicians too, and we know that what you played wasn't just technique. It was truth. Thank you for sharing it with us." The violinist nodded. "You've reminded us why we started playing in the first place. We got caught up in gigs and payments and treating this like just a job. But it's not. It's what you did tonight. Connection, emotion, humanity." Dorothy didn't know what to say. She'd only played for herself and Grace. But apparently she'd given others something too. "Thank you," she managed. "Your Mozart was beautiful." Grace loved Mozart. They smiled sadly, understanding. They shook her hand and departed. Catherine guided Dorothy toward the exit. As they walked, they passed the piano. Dorothy stopped. She looked at it. This instrument that she'd been afraid to touch. This instrument that had somehow given her back a piece of herself. She reached out and placed one hand on the smooth, black lacquer. "Thank you," she whispered to it. Then she let Catherine lead her away. The hotel room was on the 15th floor. It had a king-sized bed with white linens, a bathroom with marble counters, a window overlooking the Chicago skyline. To Dorothy, who had spent the last 6 months on shelter cots and cardboard on sidewalks, It looked like a palace. Catherine helped her inside. There are toiletries in the bathroom, clean towels. The robe is yours to keep. I've arranged for clothes to be delivered in the morning. Your size. She paused. Dorothy, is there anything else you need tonight? Dorothy looked around the room. At the bed, the bathroom, the quiet, the safety. No, she said. This is more than enough. Catherine hugged her one more time. I'll be back in the morning. We'll go to the apartment together. Get you settled. Okay. After Catherine left, Dorothy stood in the center of the room, unsure what to do first. Finally, she walked to the bathroom, turned on the shower. Hot water poured out steam, filling the space. She undressed slowly, her clothes worn and dirty. She stepped under the water, and she cried. Not from sadness, from release, from exhaustion, from relief. The hot water washed over her, washing away 6 months of street dirt, 6 years of grief, carrying it all down the drain. She stood there until the water ran cold, then longer. Finally, she dried off with the softest towel she'd ever felt. Put on the complimentary robe. It was warm and clean and smelled like lavender. She walked to the bed and sat on the edge. The mattress was firm but comfortable. She lay back, stared at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. Everything that happened tonight. The piano, the music, the crying crowd, the standing ovation, the offers of help, the apartment, the job. Grace's birthday. That's what today was. Grace's birthday. Dorothy had survived it. More than survived. She'd honored it. She'd played for Grace. And somehow Grace's memory had become a gift for others too. Dorothy closed her eyes. She was so tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired. But before she fell asleep, she whispered into the darkness, "Happy birthday, baby girl. I love you. I'll always love you. And I promise I'll keep going. I'll teach, I'll play, I'll live. For you, for Dad, for me. I'll keep going." Silence answered, but Dorothy felt for the first time in 6 years something close to peace. She slept. 3 months later, winter had fully arrived in Chicago. Snow covered the streets, holiday decorations adorned storefronts, and Dorothy Hayes stood at a piano in a community center on the south side. In front of her, 12 children sat on metal folding chairs, ages 7 to 15, some eager, some skeptical. All of them from families who couldn't afford private music lessons. All of them here because they wanted to learn. Dorothy looked at them and saw herself. Saw that 5-year-old at her grandmother's upright. Saw the girl who taught herself to play. The girl who thought maybe, just maybe, she could make something beautiful. Music, she told the children, isn't about being perfect. It's about telling truth. Your truth. Everyone has a story. Music is one way to tell it. She played a simple C major scale. This is where we start, with the basics. But these notes combined in different ways can express anything. Joy, sadness, anger, love, loss, hope. She played a chord progression. Major chords, then minor. Hear the difference. Major sounds happy. Minor sounds sad. But both are necessary. You need both to tell a complete story. The children listened, transfixed. One girl, maybe 9 years old, raised her hand. "Ms. Hayes, will you play something for us? A real song?" Dorothy smiled. "What would you like to hear?" "Something beautiful," the girl said. "The most beautiful thing you know." Dorothy thought for a moment. Then she played. Not Chopin this time. Something simpler. A spiritual she remembered from her grandmother's church. His eye is on the sparrow. Slow, gentle, filled with faith and hope, and the belief that even the smallest, most overlooked creatures matter to someone. The children listened in silence. When she finished, several were smiling. One boy had tears in his eyes. "That was beautiful," the 9-year-old girl whispered. "Thank you," Dorothy said. "Now let's learn how to make beauty ourselves." The apartment in Lincoln Park was small, but perfect. One bedroom, a living room with space for an upright piano that Patricia's foundation had donated, a kitchen where Dorothy learned to cook again, a bathroom with hot water whenever she wanted it. At night, Dorothy would sit at the piano and play, sometimes classical pieces she'd performed decades ago, sometimes simple melodies. Sometimes she just improvised, letting her fingers wander, creating something new. She thought about Grace every day. The pain hadn't disappeared. It never would. Grief doesn't work that way. You don't get over losing a child. You just learn to carry it, to integrate it into who you are. The weight never lessens, but you get stronger at bearing it. She thought about James, too. Wished he could see her now. Wished he'd held on just a little longer. But she understood why he couldn't. Some pain is too much. She didn't judge him for it. She visited their graves once a week, brought flowers, told them about her students, about the children learning to play, about the music still being made. "You'd love them," she told Grace's headstone. "There's a girl, Keisha, who reminds me so much of you. She's got your determination, your joy. She's going to be something special." The teaching job was challenging but rewarding. Many of her students had difficult home lives. Poverty, violence, instability. Music became their refuge. The 1 hour a week they spent with Dorothy was often the safest, most peaceful hour of their week. Dorothy understood. She knew what it meant to need beauty in the midst of chaos. To need something that was yours and couldn't be taken away. One boy, Marcus, 11 years old, was particularly talented. He learned quickly, progressed fast. But he was angry. He played with too much force, banging the keys. Dorothy worked with him gently. The piano isn't your enemy. You don't need to fight it. It's your friend. It wants to help you say what you're feeling. "I'm feeling angry," Marcus said. "Then play anger, but play it right. Control it. Channel it. Don't let it control you." She showed him how. How to play with power without banging. How to express rage through minor chords and dissonance and then resolve it. How to use music to process emotion instead of being consumed by it. Marcus practiced, and slowly his playing changed. Became more nuanced, more controlled, more beautiful. "My dad left," he told Dorothy one day after class. "Just left. Didn't even say goodbye." Dorothy nodded. "I'm sorry. That's not fair. How do you keep going?" "When bad things happen." Dorothy thought about the question. It was the same question she'd been asking herself for 6 years. You find something that matters. For me, it's music, and teaching you, helping you find your voice. That matters. So I keep going. Marcus considered this. "Does it get easier?" "No," Dorothy said honestly. "But you get stronger." Word spread about Dorothy Hayes, the homeless woman who played at the charity gala. The story was picked up by local news, then a national morning show. Suddenly, people knew who she was again. Concert halls reached out, offered her bookings, small venues at first. But she could rebuild her performing career if she wanted. Dorothy thought about it, considered it. But ultimately, she declined most of the offers. She wasn't that person anymore, the Dorothy who toured and recorded and performed for thousands. That Dorothy died with Grace and James. This Dorothy was different. This Dorothy taught children. This Dorothy showed up every week at community centers and schools. This Dorothy played for free at hospitals and nursing homes. This Dorothy used music to serve, not to seek acclaim. She did accept a few select performances, benefit concerts, fundraisers, always for causes related to children or music education, and she always played the same piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Grace's favorite. Every time she played it, people cried. Every time she told Grace's story, made sure people knew who she was playing for and why. "We don't know what anyone is carrying," she would tell audiences. "We don't know what pain is hidden behind someone's circumstances. Be kind. Be generous. Don't judge. Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about." On the first anniversary of that night at the Pinnacle Hotel, the foundation organized a special concert. An evening with Dorothy Hayes. All proceeds going to expand their music education programs. The venue wasn't Carnegie Hall. It was the community center where Dorothy taught. Her students performed first. 12 children nervous and excited playing simple pieces. Not perfect, lots of mistakes, but playing with heart. The audience, which included many of the people who had been at the gala that night, applauded enthusiastically. Catherine Reynolds sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Then Dorothy played. The same nocturne. The piece had become her signature, her offering, her prayer. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, but Dorothy raised her hand for silence. "1 year ago," she said, her voice steady, "I walked into a room where I didn't belong. I was homeless. Broken, lost. I had survived losing my daughter and my husband, but I hadn't really lived. I was just existing. And then I played piano, and you listened. And you helped me. You gave me back my life." She gestured to her students. "These children are why I'm here, why I teach, why I play. They deserve the same chance I got, the chance to express themselves, to find beauty, to discover that they matter, that their voices matter." She paused, looked out at the audience. "We all judge. We all make assumptions based on appearances. I'm asking you to stop, to look deeper, to see the human behind the circumstances. Because you never know who someone really is. You never know what they're carrying, what they've survived, what they're capable of." The room was silent, attentive. "My daughter Grace died when she was 18. My husband James couldn't survive losing her, and I ended up on the streets. That could happen to anyone. Job loss, medical crisis, tragedy. We're all closer to that edge than we think. And when people fall over that edge, we owe them compassion, not judgment. Not compassion." She smiled softly. "Thank you for showing me compassion. Thank you for giving me a second chance. I promise to honor it by giving these children their first chance, their chance to make beauty in a world that desperately needs it." The applause was thunderous, but more than that, it was understanding. Dorothy had taught them something. Not just that night at the gala, but in every interaction since, every performance, every story she shared. She taught them to see people differently, to value humanity over circumstance, to recognize that everyone has worth regardless of their situation. That night, after everyone had gone, Dorothy sat alone at the piano in the community center. The lights were dim. The room was quiet. She thought about the past year, the transformation, the healing, the purpose she'd found. She thought about Grace, always Grace. 26 now if she'd lived. What would she be doing? Where would she be? Dorothy would never know. But she knew Grace would be proud of her now. Proud of what she was doing, how she was helping others. She played softly. Not the nocturne this time. Something new. Something that had been forming in her mind for weeks. An original composition. Simple. Gentle. Hopeful. She called it Grace's Light. Because even though Grace was gone, even though Dorothy had walked through the darkest valley, even though she'd lost everything and survived, there was still light. Grace's love was still light. James's memory was light. The children she taught were light. And Dorothy herself, against all odds, was still here, still breathing, still creating, still adding something beautiful to the world, still light. Dorothy Hayes' story is extraordinary. But the truth is, stories like hers happen every day. People who look homeless, broken, lost. People we walk past without seeing. People we judge without knowing. Every person you pass has a story, has experienced loss or joy or triumph or tragedy that you know nothing about. The woman sleeping on the sidewalk might be a mother who lost everything trying to save her child. The man begging for change might be a veteran who gave everything for his country and got nothing back. The person who looks like they don't belong might be exactly where they need to be. We're all carrying weight we don't show. We're all fighting battles no one sees. And we all deserve to be seen, truly seen. Not judged by our worst moments or our worst circumstances, but recognized for our humanity, our worth, our potential. Dorothy played piano and reminded 400 people of their own humanity. She didn't mean to. She just played for her daughter. But that's the power of art, of vulnerability, of truth. It connects us, reminds us we're all human, all struggling, all trying to make sense of loss and pain and the impossibility of continuing when everything falls apart. But we do continue. We have to. Because there are children who need to learn piano. There are people who need to hear beauty. There is still light to be added to the world. Dorothy Hayes could have given up. She almost did. But she kept going. And because she did, 12 children are learning to play piano. 400 people were changed. And a story of hope was told. So the next time you see someone who looks like they don't belong, pause. Look closer. You don't know their story. You don't know what they've survived. You don't know what they're capable of. Don't judge. Listen. See. Be kind. Because we're all just trying to make it through. And sometimes all it takes is one person showing compassion. One person offering help. One person saying, "You belong here. You matter. Let me help." Be that person. The world needs more Catherine Reynolds. More people willing to say, "Wait. Let's see what happens." More people willing to recognize worth in unexpected places. And maybe if you're lucky, you'll witness something like what happened that night at the Pinnacle Hotel. Something transcendent. Something that reminds you why we're here. What actually matters. Music, connection, humanity, love. Those are the things that last. Long after the champagne is gone and the chandeliers are dark and the gala is over, those are the things that remain. Dorothy Hayes taught us that, and we're forever grateful. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the people you pass on the street, share it. Tell someone. And the next time you see someone who looks like they're struggling, don't look away. See them. Really see them. You might be looking at the next Dorothy Hayes. Someone with a gift, a story, a light that's been dimmed but not extinguished. Help them shine again. Thank you for listening. And remember, never judge a person by their circumstances. Judge them by their character, their heart, their humanity. We're all just walking each other home. Let's do it with kindness.